Welcome to Wild West Hearts, where honor rides with every hoofbeat. Dust burns in your lungs and every tail smells of gunpowder.
Dust hung in the air, motionless and hot. It settled on the cracked earth, on sparse tufts of withered grass, on the roof of the solitary cabin that clung to the hillside like a stubborn old claw. Not a sound disturbed the suffocating stillness. No bird call, no insect hum, nothing but the faint whisper of Thomas's own breathing. He didn't look at the sky. He knew it was empty and white with heat. His gaze was fixed on the tree. An old, dried acacia, its branches twisted as if in pain. A body hung from one of them. A woman. The rope had cut into her wrists, not her neck. This was a death designed to be slow, from thirst, from sun, from despair. On her chest hung a board, roughly nailed with a rusty nail of the remnants of her dress. The letters burned into the wood were simple and cruel. Any white man who saves her will be hanged next. Thomas swallowed dry dust. He could turn around. No one would know. No one would judge. He had come to this wasteland to be alone, to be left undisturbed. He had already paid his price to this world. But then he saw her eyes. They were nearly closed, lashes stuck together with sweat and dust. But they weren't looking at him. They weren't begging for salvation. Her gaze was desperately, with the last of her strength directed to the side, toward dense undergrowth at the base of the rock. She wasn't pleading for herself. She was almost dead. The skin on her face had cracked, her lips transformed into dry crust. The buckskin dress, once decorated with beads, was now a tattered rag soaked with sweat and fear. She was Apache, young, and all that remained alive in her was in that gaze directed at the roots of the old tree. She wasn't fighting for her own life. She was fighting for something else. Thomas approached the tree slowly. He looked at the sign, then at her face. He remembered another winter, a blizzard, and a small grave behind his cabin, marked by a nameless stone. He hadn't made it in time then, a mistake that cost a life. He pulled out his knife. The blade glinted in the sun. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about who would come for him. He thought only that another life should not end here, in this silence. He cut the rope. The woman's body fell to the ground like a sack. She was lighter than he expected. He didn't carry her to the cabin. He went where she had been looking. He pushed aside the thorny branches at the tree's roots. At first, he saw nothing, just dry leaves and dust, and then he heard a faint, barely distinguishable whimper. In a hollow, sheltered by moss and an old rag, lay a bundle, an infant, tiny, with skin drawn tight from dehydration but alive. Its eyes were closed, but it was breathing. Thomas froze. He looked at the unconscious woman, then at the child. He understood. She was bait. They had hanged her so she could watch her child die of hunger just steps away from her. He carefully picked up the bundle, then lifted the woman. He carried them both, her on one shoulder, the child pressed to his chest. He didn't choose who to save. He simply carried all that remained of their world. The cabin smelled of dust and loneliness. Thomas laid the woman on his bed, the only one in the house. The baby he placed in a toolbox, lining it with his old shirt. He didn't try to revive her. The child came first. He found a goat in the shed, milked it into a cup, diluted the milk with warm water. He dipped his finger in the milk and touched the infant's lips. The baby instinctively began to suck. Thomas did this again and again until the child began to swallow. His large, rough hands moved awkwardly but gently. When he finished, the woman was conscious. She lay on her side, facing the box. Her hand reached toward the child. She didn't look at Thomas. He didn't speak. He simply approached and placed a cup of water beside the bed. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. The sound amplified in the silence, like a gunshot in an empty canyon. He sat in the chair by the stove, the leather seat sighing under him. From a shelf, he took a small block of wood and a knife. His fingers traced the grain, feeling for the shape hidden within. He began to carve, his knife scraping softly against the wood. He worked without purpose, merely letting his hands move. Gradually, the formless block began to suggest wings. After a while, he set the half-formed carving aside and picked up her moccasin, which had nearly fallen apart. He worked in silence by lamplight, stitch by stitch. At night, fever took her. She tossed, whispered something in her language. Thomas soaked a rag in cold water and placed it on her forehead. The cloth dripped. each droplet hitting the wooden floor with a soft, echoing plink that marked the passing seconds. He didn't sleep. He sat beside her, listening to her breathing and the breathing of the child. 3 lives in one room, and silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against his eardrums like the depths of a mine shaft. By morning she was weak but clear-minded. She saw the repaired moccasin by the bed. She saw that the child was sleeping, covered with clean cloth. She looked at Thomas. He was asleep in the chair, his head dropped to his chest. His rifle stood by the door. He hadn't slept. He had been guarding. The creak of the cabin door woke her. Sunlight cut across the worn floorboards as Thomas entered, his arms full of firewood. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if he feared the sound might shatter something fragile in the air between them. "You should drink," he said, the first words he'd spoken to her. His voice was rough from disuse, like stone grinding against stone. She watched him with eyes that gave away nothing. Not fear, not gratitude, not hate. Just assessment. She had seen white men before. They were not to be trusted. Yet this one had cut her down, had saved her child. "Kaya," she said finally, touching her chest. Her voice was a dry whisper. Thomas nodded once. He didn't offer his name in return. Names meant attachment. Attachment meant pain when it was torn away. He'd learned that lesson buried in a small grave behind his cabin. The baby whimpered, and her attention immediately shifted. Thomas watched as she struggled to sit up, her muscles trembling with the effort. Without a word, he moved to help her, but she stiffened at his approach. He stopped, retreated a step, then simply placed the box within her reach. She lifted the child with practiced hands despite her weakness. The infant's face was pinched, reddened from sun exposure. Thomas turned away as she opened her dress to feed the baby. He busied himself at the stove, heating water, adding dried herbs he'd gathered from the hillside, remedies he'd learned from an old Mexican woman years ago, before the sickness took her too. "Drink this," he said later, offering a cup of bitter-smelling tea. "For the fever." She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed. Hers were small, the nails broken and caked with dirt. His were large, calloused, with scars that told stories of a life carved from unforgiving land. "Why?" she asked, the single word holding the weight of everything that had happened. Thomas moved to the window, looked out at the emptiness. The question hung between them. Why had he saved her? Why had they hanged her? Why was the world so cruel? "Doesn't matter," he said finally. What mattered was that they were both still breathing. What mattered was the child. By the 3rd day, Kaya could stand. Thomas found her outside at dawn, her face turned to the rising sun, the baby wrapped against her chest with a strip of cloth he'd given her. Her dress was still torn, but she'd washed it in the bucket he used for laundry. Her hair, long and black, hung in a single braid down her back. "They will come," she said without turning, sensing his presence behind her. "The men who did this." Thomas nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Probably I. You should make us leave." There was no self-pity in her voice, just the hard reality of survival. Thomas stepped up beside her. The land stretched out before them, golden and harsh in the morning light. In the distance, heat waves already distorted the horizon. "No." The word was simple, final. She turned to look at him then, truly studying his face. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His skin was weathered brown from sun, his beard streaked with gray. His eyes were the color of the sky just before rain, a blue so pale it was almost silver. "They will kill you," she said. Thomas almost smiled, but the expression died before it reached his eyes. "They can try." He turned back to the cabin, then paused. "My name's Thomas." It was the closest thing to a welcome he could offer. They came 2 days later, 3 men, scalp hunters. They didn't look like bandits. They looked like men doing their job. Clean boots, good horses, calm eyes. They stopped at the fence. Thomas stepped onto the porch. He didn't take his rifle. "Looking for an Apache woman," said the oldest. "Escaped from our camp. We were escorting her." "Haven't seen anyone," Thomas replied. At that moment, the baby's cry came from behind the cabin door. The hunter's eyes narrowed. "You say no one?" Thomas didn't flinch. "Said what I said." The hunter smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be back, farmer, when we're sure." They rode away. Thomas went inside. Kaya stood by the window, clutching the child to her. She had heard everything. She wasn't crying. She was just watching the road they had taken. "They know," she said. "Yes," he answered. He didn't tell her to leave. He simply went to the shed and began reinforcing the shutters on the cabin windows. Night fell like a heavy blanket over the land. Thomas sat by the window, rifle across his knees. Kaya had fed the baby and now sat on the bed, sewing by lamplight. She had taken one of his old shirts and was transforming it into a carrier for the child. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, despite her still healing wounds. "Who were they?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. Kaya's hands stilled. "Buffalo soldiers hire them to clear land, make safe for settlers." Her English was better than he'd expected, though she spoke in fragments, careful with each word. "They hang women for that?" Her eyes met his, dark and unfathomable. "I killed 2 men. They tried to." She looked down at the baby. "After my husband died in the reservation, the sickness, I ran." Thomas nodded. He didn't need to hear more. The story was familiar enough. White men's promises broken, native people corralled onto barren land, disease spreading through crowded camps, and women, always women paying the price. "Your son," she said, changing the subject. "The grave outside." Thomas's grip tightened on the rifle. "Eli," he said, the name like a stone in his throat. "Fever took him 3 winters ago." "His mother?" "Never was one, just us." He didn't elaborate. Didn't tell her about the saloon girl who'd left the newborn on his doorstep with a note saying the child was his. Didn't tell her how he'd fallen in love with the boy despite his doubts, how Eli had become his whole world, how he'd failed him. Kaya seemed to understand what he didn't say. "My son has no name yet," she said softly. "Apache, wait until we know the child will live." Thomas looked at the sleeping infant. "He'll live," he said with a certainty he hadn't felt about anything in years. "We'll make sure of it." The "we" hung in the air between them, unexamined but present. 2 broken people, thrown together by cruelty, forming something neither had planned. "Sleep," Thomas said, turning back to the window. "I'll keep watch." Kaya didn't argue. She lay down beside the makeshift cradle, one hand resting on the edge so she could feel any movement. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened. Thomas watched the darkness, thinking about the men who would come, thinking about the choices that had led him here. He had wanted solitude, had built his life around the absence of connection after Eli died. Now his cabin held a woman and child he was prepared to die defending. Life had a way of circling back on itself, he thought, like the seasons, like the hunt. There was no escaping what was meant to find you. They returned in the night, 5 of them, with torches. "Farmer, hand over the woman and child. We don't want blood." The voice was calm, businesslike. Thomas stood behind the door. He looked at Kaya. She held the baby and the second rifle he had given her. He hadn't asked if she knew how to shoot. He had simply shown her how to load. "They will kill you," she whispered. Thomas looked at the small grave outside the window, barely visible in the torchlight. "I was too late once," he said. "Won't be late again." He opened the door. Gunshots shattered the silence. The reports crashed against the hills and returned as hollow echoes. Thomas didn't aim to kill, but at the torches. One by one they went out, plunging the yard into darkness. The hunters cursed, firing blindly at the cabin. Each muzzle flash briefly illuminated their faces, frozen masks of anger and fear. A bullet pierced the wall near Kaya. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. She didn't flinch. She fired back, into the darkness, toward where the flash had just been. There was a scream, high and animal-like, cutting through the night. The siege was short and brutal. Thomas took a bullet in the shoulder. The impact spun him around, the hot metal burning through flesh with sickening ease. Blood ran down his arm, but he didn't drop the rifle. They held their ground. They were no longer victim and savior. They were 2 people defending their home. Realizing there would be no easy prey, the hunters retreated, carrying their wounded. Their horses' hooves pounded the earth, the sound diminishing until all that remained was the acrid smell of gunpowder and the ringing in their ears. The cabin smelled of gunpowder. Silence pressed down. Thomas sank into a chair, pressing his hand to his shoulder. Kaya approached him. She silently took a rag, moistened it, and began cleaning his wound. The baby slept in the box, undisturbed by the noise. She worked with concentration. Her hands didn't tremble. When she finished, she looked at him. In her eyes was neither gratitude nor debt. There was something else. Acceptance they had survived. Together. In the small cabin in the middle of wasteland, a family was born. Not by blood, but by choice. In the days that followed, as his wound began to heal, Thomas found the half-carved piece of wood he had set aside. He turned it in his hands, studying what he had begun. The wings were there in the suggestion of a head, a bird taking shape. He took up his knife again and continued, each cut more deliberate now, more certain. Dawn broke cold and clear. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, letting Kaya examine his wound. The bullet had gone clean through, missing bone. Lucky, though it didn't feel that way. Every movement sent fire through his shoulder and down his arm. Need to cauterize, she said, her face grave. Thomas nodded. He'd seen men die from lesser wounds when infections set in. He watched as she heated his hunting knife in the fire. Her movements efficient, practiced. Her people knew about wounds, about survival. Bite this, she said, offering him a folded leather strap. He took it between his teeth, bracing himself. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a shared understanding of pain, of endurance. The pain came white-hot and blinding when she pressed the knife to his wound. He didn't cry out. His vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then expanded again. He tasted blood where he'd bitten through the leather. Done, she said, applying a poultice of herbs she'd found in his supplies. Thomas spat out the strap, breathing hard. You've done that before. A shadow passed over her face. Many times, war with white men, war between tribes, always wounds to heal. She wrapped his shoulder with strips torn from one of his shirts. Her touch was gentle despite the strength in her hands. When she finished, she didn't move away immediately. Her fingers lingered on his skin, tracing an old scar that ran across his collarbone. This one, she asked. Comanche, 15 years ago. I was scouting for the army. It was a lifetime ago before he'd turned his back on that world. She nodded, unsurprised. And this? Her finger moved to a puckered scar on his forearm. Bar fight, Silver City. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You fight much. Used to, he admitted. He'd been a different man then. Angry, reckless, seeking death in every confrontation. Until Eli had given him a reason to live. The baby's cry interrupted them. Kaya moved away, lifting the child from his makeshift bed. The moment of intimacy passed, but something had shifted between them. They will come again, she said, rocking the fussing infant. More men, more guns. Thomas stood, testing his injured arm. Pain shot through him, but it was manageable. Then we need to be ready. Together they began preparing for a siege. Days passed with no sign of the hunters. Thomas's wound began to heal, though the pain remained a constant companion. Each morning he scanned the horizon for dust clouds that would signal riders approaching. Each night he slept in fits, one ear alert for the sound of horses. Life settled into a strange, tentative rhythm. Kaya cooked with the supplies he had, stretching them with plants she gathered from the surrounding land. She seemed to know which roots could be eaten, which berries were safe. Thomas watched her work, moving with the grace of someone attuned to the harsh landscape in ways he'd never mastered despite his years there. The baby grew stronger. His cries became more insistent, his eyes, dark like his mother's, more alert. Thomas found himself talking to the child during the long afternoons when Kaya rested. Simple words, meaningless things about the weather or the goats or the way the light changed on the distant mountains. Words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire, Thomas sat on the porch mending a bridle. Kaya emerged from the cabin, the baby sleeping against her chest in the carrier she'd fashioned. We should leave, she said without preamble. When you are stronger, they will not stop hunting us. Thomas's hand stilled on the leather. Where would you go? North, other Apache bands, mountains. Winter's coming, mountains will be hard with the baby. She met his gaze steadily. Here is hard too. He couldn't argue with that. The hunters would return, probably with more men. The odds were against them. The sensible thing would be to part ways, Kaya to her people, him back to his solitude. But the thought hollowed something in his chest. I know a place, he said finally. South, cross the border. Small village where no one asked questions. I have a friend there. Friend was too strong a word for the old Mexican farmer who'd once helped Thomas when he was on the run himself, but it was close enough. Hope flickered across Kaya's face, quickly masked. You would come? The question hung between them. Would he abandon the home he'd built? The land he'd claimed? The grave of his son? Yes, he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Nothing here worth dying for anymore. That night they began to plan. Thomas woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Not many, a single rider approaching fast. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. Kaya was already awake, the baby clutched to her chest, her eyes wide in the pre-dawn darkness. Stay inside, he whispered, moving to the window. Through a crack in the shutters, he saw a lone figure on horseback, riding hard toward the cabin. Not one of the hunters. The silhouette was wrong, the horse too small. As the rider drew closer, Thomas made out a boy, maybe 14 or 15, his clothes dusty from the trail. Thomas Harding, the boy called, reining in his mount at a safe distance from the cabin. Message for you. Thomas hesitated, glancing at Kaya. It could be a trap. I know that boy, he said low. Works for the telegraph office in town. Cautiously, rifle still ready, Thomas opened the door and stepped onto the porch. What is it, Jimmy? The boy held out a folded paper. Telegraph came yesterday. Man paid extra to have it brought out to you right away. Thomas took the paper, handed the boy a coin. Any trouble in town? Jimmy shook his head. Just the usual, though there's some Buffalo soldiers camped outside. Looking for renegade Indians, they say. His eyes flickered to the cabin door, then back to Thomas. You take care now, Mr. Harding. The boy wheeled his horse and rode off. Thomas waited until he was out of sight before unfolding the paper. The message was brief. Hunters coming, full company. Dawn tomorrow, run. Martinez, the saloon keeper in town. One of the few men Thomas counted as something close to a friend. He went inside, handed the paper to Kaya. She read it slowly, her brow furrowed with concentration. We leave now, she said, already moving to gather what little she had. Thomas nodded. Pack food, I'll get the horses. There was no time for hesitation, for second thoughts. They worked in silent efficiency, gathering only what was essential for survival. Thomas took a small tin box from beneath a floorboard, his savings, meager but enough for what they needed. He added a frayed photograph, a dark-haired boy with solemn eyes, slipping it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Kaya watched him kneel by the small grave behind the cabin. He placed a hand on the unmarked stone, his lips moving in words she couldn't hear. When he rose, his face was set, determined. Within an hour, they were ready. 2 horses, his sturdy gelding and the old mare he used for plowing. Bedrolls, food, water, ammunition. The baby, securely wrapped against Kaya's chest. All that remained of their separate lives now joined in flight. As they rode away from the cabin, Thomas didn't look back. The past was buried there. Whatever lay ahead, survival or death, they would face it together. They rode hard through the day, following game trails and dry creek beds to avoid leaving tracks. Thomas led them south and west, toward the border, through terrain so harsh few men ventured there willingly. The baby, remarkably, slept through most of the journey, lulled by the rhythm of the horse and Kaya's heartbeat. By dusk, they had covered nearly 30 miles. Thomas called a halt in a narrow canyon where a spring bubbled from the rock face, creating a small oasis of green amid the desert brown. We'll rest here, he said, dismounting stiffly. The day's ride had reopened his wound, and blood had soaked through the bandage, staining his shirt. Kaya slid from her horse with a grace that belied her exhaustion. She helped Thomas remove the saddles, then insisted on checking his wound. Bad, she said simply, examining the angry red flesh. Thomas grimaced. It'll hold. She gave him a look that said she didn't believe him, but wouldn't argue. Instead, she gathered herbs from around the spring, crushed them between 2 stones, and applied the paste to his shoulder after cleaning the wound with water. They ate a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, neither willing to risk a fire that might be seen. As night deepened around them, the temperature dropped sharply. Desert extremes, burning by day, freezing by night. Without discussion, they spread their bedrolls side by side for warmth. The baby nestled between them, swaddled in every spare piece of cloth they had. Thomas lay on his good side, facing outward, his rifle within reach. Kaya faced the opposite direction, her back against his, a knife clutched in her hand. Sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. Wake me in 4 hours, she replied, her voice already heavy with exhaustion. But Thomas didn't wake her. He watched the stars wheel overhead, listened to the night sounds of the desert, and kept his vigil. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he knew fever wasn't far behind. They needed to reach the border before he became a liability. In the darkest hour before dawn, the baby stirred, whimpering softly. Before the sound could grow to a cry that might carry in the night, Thomas carefully lifted the child, cradling him awkwardly against his chest with his good arm. "Shh, little one," he whispered, the words strange on his tongue. He hadn't spoken to an infant since Eli. "Your mama needs rest." To his surprise, the baby quieted, tiny fingers curling around the rough fabric of his shirt. Thomas felt something crack open inside him. A door he thought had been sealed permanently with his son's death. "You're a strong one," he murmured, "like your mother." He told the child about the stars overhead, about the land they were crossing, about the place they were going, promises of safety, of a future, words he wasn't sure he believed but needed to say. When Kaya woke at dawn, she found Thomas sitting with her son, both of them asleep, the child's head tucked beneath the man's bearded chin. She didn't wake them immediately. Instead, she watched, memorizing the image, storing it away against whatever hardships lay ahead. They reached the border 3 days later. Thomas's fever had worsened, but he pushed on, driven by a determination that surprised even him. Kaya had taken to riding beside him, ready to catch him if he swayed in the saddle. The crossing point was a nameless stretch of river, shallow enough to ford easily. On the other side lay Mexico, not safety exactly, but a place where American scalp hunters might think twice before following. As they urged their tired horses into the water, Thomas glanced back. The American frontier stretched behind them, harsh and beautiful and deadly. A land he had once thought would be his home until death. Now it was just another place he was leaving behind. "No regrets?" Kaya asked, seeing his backward look. Thomas turned to her, to the child who now slept more peacefully, his cheeks fuller than when they'd found him. "No," he said honestly. "No regrets." They crossed the river as the sun reached its zenith, the water sparkling around the horse's legs. On the southern bank, Thomas swayed dangerously, nearly falling. Kaya reached out, her hand steadying on his arm. "Not far now," he assured her, though his vision was beginning to blur. They rode through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing. More green, less dust. Signs of cultivation appeared. A field of corn, a stretch of beans climbing poles, a few scattered adobe houses in the distance. By sunset, they reached a small village nestled against low hills. Dogs barked at their approach. Children stopped their play to stare. Thomas led them to a house on the outskirts, larger than the others, with a covered porch and a corral for animals. An old man emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face was deeply lined, his hair white, but his back straight as a young man's. He stared at them for a long moment, then broke into a wide grin. "Thomas Harding," he said in accented English, "you look like death warmed over." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Rodrigo, need help." Then the world tilted sideways and darkness claimed him. He woke to the smell of cooking and the low murmur of women's voices. For a moment he was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above him swimming in and out of focus. Then memory returned. The flight, the crossing, Rodrigo's house. "Kaya," he tried to say, but his voice emerged as a croak. A figure moved to his bedside, not Kaya, but an older Mexican woman with kind eyes. "Drink," she said, holding a cup to his lips. The water was cool and sweet. He drank deeply, then tried again. "The woman and child who were with me, safe," the woman assured him. "My husband's friend's wife is Apache. They are with her." Relief washed through him. He tried to sit up, but firm hands pressed him back. "You have fever," the woman said. "Very bad. 2 days now. Rest." 2 days? He'd lost 2 days to fever? Alarm shot through him. "The hunters." "No one has crossed the river," she said. "My son's watch. Now rest, or the fever will take you." Despite his concern, exhaustion pulled him back under. The next time he woke, it was night. A single candle burned beside the bed, and there was Kaya sitting in a chair, mending what looked like a small shirt. The baby lay in a proper cradle nearby. "You're here," he said, his voice stronger. She looked up, relief visible in her eyes. "The fever broke this morning. Magdalena said you would wake soon." "The baby?" "He is well, growing stronger." There was a softness in her voice when she spoke of her son that Thomas had never heard before. He managed to sit up this time, grimacing at the stiffness in his shoulder. The wound had been redressed, clean white bandages replacing the blood-soaked cloth they'd used on the trail. "Rodrigo's people have been kind," Kaya said, setting aside her sewing. "They say we can stay. There is work, a small house at the edge of the village." Thomas studied her face in the candlelight. There was something different about her, a calmness, perhaps. The constant vigilance had eased from her eyes. "You want to stay here?" he asked carefully. She met his gaze steadily. "There are Apache nearby. Not my band, but they welcome us. And here, no one looks at my son as less because his father was killed by white men." It made sense. Here she could build a life among people who understood her ways, who wouldn't judge her for who she was. Here her son could grow up with dignity. "And you?" she asked. "Will you go back?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought beyond escape, beyond keeping them alive. "Back? To your cabin, your land." She hesitated. "Your son's grave." The mention of Eli's grave struck him like a physical blow. He'd left it behind, the small stone marker, the place where he'd buried not just his son, but his heart. "I don't know," he answered honestly. Kaya nodded, accepting his uncertainty. "Rest now. We will talk tomorrow." As she rose to leave, he caught her hand. The touch was impulsive, unplanned. Her skin was warm against his. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving me behind." A smile touched her lips, the first true smile he'd seen from her. "We do not leave family behind." The word family lingered in the air long after she had gone. Days became weeks. Thomas regained his strength slowly, spending long hours on Rodrigo's porch, watching the life of the village unfold before him. Kaya and the baby stayed in a small house nearby, but she came each day, bringing food, checking his wound, sitting with him in comfortable silence. The people of the village accepted them without question. Here, a white man and an Apache woman were just two more souls seeking refuge from the violence of the frontier. No one asked about the bullet wound in Thomas's shoulder or the rope scars on Kaya's wrists. Such marks were common enough in the borderlands. As autumn deepened, Thomas found himself thinking more of his cabin, of the life he'd left behind. Not with regret, but with a strange detachment, as if those years belonged to someone else. The only thing that pulled at him was Eli's grave, solitary and untended on the hillside. One evening, as the sun set behind the western hills, painting the adobe walls golden, Kaya found him sitting beneath the old mesquite tree in Rodrigo's yard. "You are troubled," she said, settling beside him on the bench. Thomas didn't deny it. They had developed an honesty between them that made lies impossible. "I keep thinking of the grave," he admitted, leaving him there alone. Kaya was silent for a long moment. "In my tribe, we believe the dead are never truly gone. Their spirits walk beside us." She touched her chest. "They live here, not in the ground." "Do you believe that?" he asked. "I do." She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "But I also understand what it means to leave someone behind." The baby cooed from the sling across her chest. He was plumper now, his eyes alert and curious. They had taken to calling him Little One in both their languages, postponing the more formal naming. "I've been thinking," Thomas said slowly, "when spring comes, I could go back. Just long enough to—" He trailed off, unsure how to express what he needed to do. "To bring him here," Kaya finished for him. Thomas nodded, grateful for her understanding. "We will go together," she said simply. "All of us. It could be dangerous." "Life is dangerous." She said it without drama, a simple statement of fact from a woman who had faced death and survived. "But some things are worth the risk." From his pocket, Thomas took the small wooden bird he had been carving since that first night in the cabin. It was nearly complete now. Wings outstretched, head lifted as if in flight. He ran his thumb over the smooth surface, feeling the grain of the wood, the soul he had coaxed from it. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. The proud set of her shoulders, The quiet strength in her face, the way she held herself as if ready for whatever came next. In that moment, he realized he had come to care for her in ways he hadn't thought possible after Eli's death. Kaya, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. She waited, patient. I don't know what this is between us, he finally said. I don't know if it has a name or if it should, but I know I don't want to lose it. A slow smile spread across her face, warming her eyes. Then don't, she said simply. She reached out, her fingers brushing his weathered cheek. The touch was light but deliberate, an invitation, not a demand. Thomas caught her hand, pressed it more firmly against his face. They sat like that as darkness fell, connected by touch, by shared survival, by something growing between them that neither had expected to find again. Winter in the borderlands was mild compared to what Thomas had known further north, but the nights were cold enough to require fires and extra blankets. By unspoken agreement, he had moved into Kaya's small house at the edge of the village. 2 rooms, adobe walls, a dirt floor swept clean each morning. It wasn't much, but it was more home than his cabin had ever been. They developed routines. Thomas worked with Rodrigo's sons, helping with livestock and repairs. Kaya cooked, tended the baby, and taught the village women Apache remedies for common ailments. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. They shared a bed out of practicality at first, warmth, space, the need to hear the baby's cries in the night. Physical intimacy came gradually, tentatively, both of them carrying wounds deeper than those visible on their bodies. But there was healing in touch, in the discovery that tenderness was still possible in a world that had shown them so much cruelty. The baby thrived. He began to sit up, to reach for things, to laugh, a sound so unexpected and joyful the first time they heard it that they both stared in amazement. Thomas found himself storing away these moments, hoarding them against the darkness he knew still waited beyond their small circle of light. Word came occasionally from across the border. Buffalo soldiers still patrolled, but the scalp hunters had moved on to other territories, other victims. Whether they had given up the search or merely postponed it was impossible to know. As winter gave way to early spring, Thomas and Kaya began planning their journey north. Not to stay, they had found something worth keeping in this quiet village, but to complete what had been left unfinished. The night before they were to leave, Thomas sat on their small porch, whittling a piece of wood. Under his hands, it was slowly taking the shape of a bird, a gift for the child who watched him work with fascinated eyes. Kaya joined him, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. It's time, she said quietly. Thomas paused, knife poised over wood. Time to name him. She looked down at the baby, who was playing with a scrap of leather on the blanket at their feet. He has lived through winter. He is strong. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest, pride, fear, love, all mingled together. Naming was permanent. Naming meant admitting how much they had to lose. What name would you give him, he asked. Kaya was silent for a long moment, watching her son. In my tribe, a child's name often comes from a dream or a sign from the spirits. She looked up at Thomas. I dreamed of a bird flying from a burning tree, carrying something precious in its claws. Thomas looked down at the half-carved bird in his hands. Coincidence, perhaps, or something more. But, she continued, I thought... She hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. I thought we might name him Eli. The knife stilled in Thomas's hand. He felt as if all the air had been squeezed from his lungs. Like your son, she said softly. If that would honor him. Thomas looked at the child, this tiny being who had brought them together, who had given him a reason to live when he thought all reasons were buried in a shallow grave. Not a replacement for the son he'd lost. A new life. A continuation. Yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. That would honor him. They sat together as twilight deepened, the 3 of them, Kaya, Thomas, and little Eli. Not a family formed by blood or birth, but by choice, by survival, by the stubborn insistence that life could be rebuilt from the ashes of the past. Tomorrow they would ride north, facing whatever dangers waited. They would bring back what needed to be brought back. They would close the circle, and then they would return to this place that had become home, carrying their past with them but no longer defined by it. Thomas reached for Kaya's hand, found it waiting for his. Their fingers intertwined as their lives had become intertwined, unexpectedly, against all odds, creating something neither had believed possible. Eli, he said, testing the name, feeling its weight on his tongue after so long. Not a burden anymore, but a blessing. The baby looked up at the sound, as if already recognizing it as his own. His eyes, dark like his mother's, but with a light in them that was entirely new, met Thomas's, and he smiled. Thomas didn't try to stop the tears that came then. They weren't tears of grief, though grief would always be part of him. They were tears of recognition, of acceptance, of the knowledge that love, when given, was never truly lost. It just found new ways to continue. A week later, they returned. Thomas carried a small bundle wrapped in his best shirt. They buried it beneath a young mesquite tree behind their house. No marker was needed. They would know. They would remember. That night, as Eli slept peacefully in his cradle, Thomas sat on the porch, looking at the stars. Kaya joined him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Is it finished now?" she asked quietly. Thomas considered the question. Was anything ever truly finished? Or did life simply continue, taking new forms, finding new paths? "No," he said finally, "not finished, just continuing." She nodded, understanding. Like the seasons. Like the seasons, he agreed. They sat in silence, watching the night sky. Thomas thought of the journey that had brought them here, from a hanging tree to this place of refuge, from strangers to family, from despair to something that, if not quite hope, was at least its close cousin. The old Thomas, the lonely, bitter man who had found a woman hanging from a tree, would never have imagined this moment, would never have believed he deserved it. Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps none of them deserved the good or the bad that came their way. Perhaps life simply was, and the only choice was how to meet it, with fear or with courage, with hatred or with love. He had made his choice that day beneath the acacia. And though the road had been hard and would likely be hard again, he wouldn't change it, not for anything. "We should sleep," Kaya said eventually, rising and holding out her hand. Thomas took it, feeling its strength, its warmth. Together they went inside, to their son, to their home, to the life they were building word by word, day by day, choice by choice. Not an ending, a continuation.